Professor Anthony Costello. First thing I'm going to do, keep the microphone on, remove my jacket. Thank you. No, I'm going to hold it because it works better that way. Thank you all for being here this evening. Those of you who are football fans, we'll try to get you home by third quarter. Those of you that would rather be working in the studios, we'll see if we can't get you on the elevators as soon as possible. Actually, I'm very pleased to be speaking to you this evening because whenever I talk about work of our students, it's a very easy subject and one with which I do with great pride. You will be seeing 600 slides, and I checked with Bob Fisher, and there is an 8 o'clocker scheduled in here tomorrow morning. So out of necessity, we will be moving rather rapidly. And actually, it's quite good because I don't think that the specifics of the topic tonight, Urban Design Studios, is really as important as trying to give you an overview of what we have been doing throughout the state of Indiana for the last, actually, decade. For some of you from small, rural, white Indiana, it will give you a chance to see our involvement in urban black cities. And for those of you from the black inner city neighborhoods, it will give you a chance to see our involvement in white, small town, like 2,000 total population, Hoosier towns and villages. If I may have the slides and somehow get all this mechanical equipment working, including lights, we'll start. I know that there are a lot of freshmen here. I'm not sure if all 80 are here. But maybe we should talk a little bit about what is this thing that you've been hearing about called urban design, and why are we studying it? Well, obviously, I believe in it greatly. I think it's one of the most needed areas in the environmental design fields. That includes architecture, landscape architecture, and urban and regional planning. And actually, it's quite new. As a matter of fact, if you look at college catalogs of the early 60s, you won't find urban design listed, especially for undergraduate education of architects and landscape architects. You'll normally find it, if you do, amalgamated with graduate programs in urban and regional planning. However, in the 60s, the professions began to realize that somewhere between planning on the one hand and architecture on the other hand laid a fairly broad field. Now, maybe we should describe a little bit about what we mean. On the left, and this is not in any way trying to construe political leanings, but on the left we have planning, and for me that's rather broad-based look and strategies at the allocation of resources. On the other hand, you have architects that design single structures, landscape architects who do single projects involving town squares, alleyways, so on and so forth. In other words, small individual projects. And I think you can see between the broad scope strategies and these individual projects lies a tremendous area, and one that the field and the new profession of urban design is beginning to fill. Obviously, urban designers are stepping on the feet of people who have, for the most part, been involved in designing cities, zoning administrators, mayors, town councils, so on and so forth, who in some cases, and in many cases actually, have probably done more designing of cities. In other words, actually having an impact and a final say about the physical involvement or the physical environment of our cities than trained environmental designers. So urban designers, out of necessity, have gotten involved in the process of what makes a city work, because in order to design a city and get it implemented, you must deal with the administrative structure. So I guess hopefully that tells a little bit about urban design. It does hopefully wind up with a physical design solution. And in that regard, I think it's very appropriate that undergraduate architects and landscape architects and of course graduate planners as well, become involved in the field, at least have an appreciation of it. One quarter does not make an urban designer, but we feel that at least an exposure to it is certainly part of every architect's and landscape architect's involvement here in their 5-year undergraduate program. The term studio, I guess, is fairly evident. There may be a few lay people here who do not really understand what it is in terms of training and educating environmental designers. The studio, of course, is something that our students are involved in from freshman year through to thesis. And it's interesting that the studio in urban design hopefully is not held in this structure or any other structure here. For the most part, we're out in the field. And in this regard, I am a great proponent of hands-on involvement. And with urban design, if you're going to study a city, you do not do it within the confines of these walls, you do it on site. So the studio becomes a rather mobile situation in which we go where the action is, so to speak. Historically, I think a note about urban design studios. For us who are now in the lethargic 70s, as some sociologists are beginning to write, the 60s, in retrospect, were truly a very dynamic decade. And I'm sure all of us lived through it, hopefully. You know, urban riots, Operation Breakthrough, landing on the moon, university riots, all in a sense, I think, developed and generated the atmosphere which spurned the urban design studio. And of course, we're not the only college, thank heavens, that have been doing this. There have been many other colleges, some before us. I think we certainly have been keeping pace since our involvement, that began to look for options to the behind-the-walls education that takes place within schools such as this. And students and faculty and administrators alike sought to become involved, and the terms hands-on experience, storefront studio, became part of the jargon that we now take as fairly standard. I think it's interesting that, of course, the whole upheaval of our cities in the 60s did, in a sense, get us involved as educators of environmental designers with the students and the urban environment. So there's a direct correlation then between this development of this process, this methodology for training urban designers, and some of the rather unfortunate occurrences that did take place in our cities. In some cases, our cities are better off for it. We have a more responsive administration in some cities. I think our educational institutions are much better off for the 60s. At least I think we're a little bit more responsive to some options, to some of the more standard and accepted practices, supposedly to educate and train environmental designers. A few things about that process. Number one, urban design is really a rather exciting discipline. It is multidisciplinary, for one. It gets architects hopefully rubbing shoulders with sociologists, economists, transportation engineers, and of course with other environmental designers such as landscape architects and planners. It gets the students involved, as I mentioned earlier, not only with designers, but with administrators, with both the public and private sector. And I think you will see in this evening's lecture that our college has been involved with both city administrations and with some private organizations, Chamber of Commerce's, merchants groups, nonprofit housing corporations, so on and so forth, who represent the private sector. And urban design is unique in that it is really a discipline that relies upon both public and private initiative in order for it to accomplish many of the aims of a better urban environment. The other thing that's exciting is, as I mentioned, I'm kind of a hands-on person, and for me urban design is about 3% theory and about 97% involvement. And by that I mean you learn how to deal with the people. whether that's a black advocacy group or a board of zoning appeal or a board of trustees of a small town, really getting most urban design goals fulfilled is a matter of how to deal with people, a sense of how to deal with the fourth dimension, time, how do you lay on the people the right amount, not absolutely staggering them with our wonderful proposals. And their first notion is, well, how are we going to afford this? And so it is part of the education of urban design studios to become involved in the group dynamics. The other thing that I know, I'm sure everybody in this school on the faculty who have been involved in urban design preach, and that is that the only real constant in our cities is change. And that's a really important concept, for our cities are living organisms, and you have to deal with change. As a matter of fact, you are involved in change. And to understand change, I think, on the part of urban designers is an absolute critical part of learning the process. The other thing you'll see this evening is, of course, the fact that we have helped communities, and therefore the notion of a service. If you also look at our urban design involvements as research, and whenever I've been involved in them, I certainly look at my involvement as taking part in research, then teaching, research, and service are the three university involvements. And so our urban design studios, in fact, do address all three issues at the same time, which I think, in fact, make them a very unique methodology. The other thing you will notice, and I might just, you're going to see approximately 9 years of work. A lot of student hours are up here, will be up here on this screen. And I think what's interesting is I think we've become a little bit more sophisticated, or at least more knowledgeable about recording the process. You will see in the first projects from the late 60s and early 70s a lot of products, a lot of final drawings and models, which are all very pretty, but really don't give an understanding of how they were generated. Lately, I think we've become much more involved in recording that process, that group dynamics that I spoke about. And so I think you will see an improvement simply in the college's ability to record the involvement of our students. Also, and this is biased, obviously, and I will admit it, I'm going to spend a little bit longer time on the projects that I've been involved in, and I am certainly not the only one. I would say about 70% of our faculty in one way or another has been involved in urban design studios, but obviously I am most familiar with those that I have been in charge of or at least been involved in, and so you are getting a slightly caused, biased viewpoint this evening on the projects that I have been involved in. I think you all know, or most of you know, that the college was founded by a state legislative act in 1965, and we admitted our first class in September of '66. We did not wait, and we normally have our students take part in urban design studios during their 4th year of study. The college did not wait, however, for the first 4th year class. Yeah, that's the one. One back, please. Okay. I should have taken up the piano. It's very difficult. No, get the, yeah, that's perfect. Beautiful. Our college did not wait for its first 4th year class. As a matter of fact, the freshman class became involved in Mitchell, Indiana, and a Gus Grissom memorial project was actually our college's first involvement in a real world situation, so to speak. At that time, the faculty was 4, including the dean, and Dave Hermanson, Bob Lackney, and Dick Pollock had, I guess at that time, about 130 freshmen dealing with proposals for a Gus Grissom project. The slide on the right shows the old Quonset huts across the street. One of the goals, of course, is not only to get our students out into the cities and towns of Indiana, but at times it's to get citizens who are involved in urban design studios into this building now, and at that time, of course, across the street. And so right from the very beginning, I think this college has had a philosophy of, number 1, real-world projects, and number 2, dealing with kind of current problems. And as I said, we started with our first freshman class. The second year, my first year here, we had our second year students involved in 3 community-based projects. On the left is a downtown mall. Dave Hermanson and Bob Lackney with a group of students in the summer. The middle shows the Huffer Memorial Child Care Center, a proposal, and on the right shows a new town for Gary, Indiana, under their Model Cities program. As you know, Muncie now has a downtown Walnut Plaza, I should say. The Huffer Child Care Center is operating and has been for 4 years on Elgin Street. The Gary project, of course, has not been fulfilled, and projects like that take anywhere from 25 to 100 years. But I think it's interesting that projects have been taken by professional architects and landscape architects, and our student involvement is basically that of generating initial ideas. I will talk a little bit later about some of the constraints, and one of them is when projects go beyond this phase, then we absolutely require that registered professional architects and landscape architects be involved in the final generation of the project. Our first urban design studio took place in the autumn of 1969. That was our first 4th year class. And we concentrated on the inner city of Indianapolis. My previous urban design involvement myself was large city. 2 academic problems in New York City, one in Red Hook and Brooklyn, and one in the upper east side, Yorkville section. Red Hook is a basically black low-income neighborhood in Brooklyn, and the Upper East Side, the Yorkville area, is a multi-ethnic area. And then my only professional involvement had been at Columbia University doing a housing project for the Morningside Heights area. So I naturally was biased toward big cities. And having arrived in Muncie, I immediately said, where can we do a large city urban design project? And of course, Indianapolis is Indiana's largest city. We've also used visiting critics, I think, very effectively in our urban design studios. The project was under my direction and that of David Meeker, second from the left. David was at that time the head of the Department of Metropolitan Development of the City of Indianapolis. He is now Undersecretary of HUD for Community Development. So you see some of our faculty members, even visiting ones, go quite a long way. Don Perry is a gentleman on the extreme right. Don is a Indianapolis architect and urban designer and has actually been a visiting critic 6 times now with us. These 2 people not only are registered architects, but they are, in this particular case, resource people whose input you simply cannot give enough credit to. Whenever we go into a city, we rely upon those local resource people, and in this case, we had absolutely 2 of the finest people. By the way, Roger Neuenschwander is the student on the left. Roger is now at the Wharton School of Finance at Penn, getting an MBA degree along with an MArch degree after graduating here, I believe, in 1974. Didn't want to leave Roger out of that photograph. Actually, what we did is we asked Don and Dave to just tell us all the projects which they thought were available in Indianapolis, and they came up with 57 projects that they felt were current and needed study. And we simply, you know, we kind of ran blind for a while. We let the students do what they wanted. Well, we got everything from a project here studying the interstate as it goes through downtown Indianapolis. Another student studied the transportation systems on a smaller scale, rapid transit lines, the second-level walkway system that's proposed, and a multi-mode station in which rapid transit passengers would transfer to rubber-wheeled vehicles, so on and so forth. As you can see, the presentations are left entirely up to the students in this particular project. Another student studied the Monument Mall, some of its potentials as an open space in the urban context. Other students took more building types of projects, such as this multi-function building for downtown on Monument Circle. Another student, Craig Mullen, studied the IU-PUI campus, which will, they believe, eventually grow to 25,000 students. Craig, on the left and the center slide, studied all of the subsystems, kind of what we call the infrastructure. Sewer, water lines, the movement of supplies, the movement of people, the movement of cars, the movement of service vehicles. And after getting about 15 of these drawings, he decided that the third dimension was a better way. And so what came out of it was a model on the left that strips away all the trappings and simply shows the guts of the city, in a sense, at the university, and basically simply blocks out the buildings. We had Phil Wisely study the IU Med Center, which is an incredible project, for those of you that know the size of it, and kind of developed a strategy for a future growth of that medical facility. Two students worked on Lockerbie Square. Lockerbie Square is a historic district immediately east, a little bit northeast, I guess, of the downtown area, some of the potentials of that as a residential neighborhood and rejuvenating it as a historic district. Another student also studied that. You can see the wide range of presentations from model form through to drawing form, and I think it shows the wide diversity and skills of our students. Rod Underwood, who is presently on our faculty, and Barry Smith teamed up and took the southeast quadrant where the Lilly factory and research and headquarters are, and did basically a neighborhood study for that section of the city. Elwood G studied basically a black neighborhood and some proposals for infill housing. We had an exhibit through Dave Meeker. It's nice to have the head of the Department of Metropolitan Development on your team. We had an exhibit, Indianapolis 2000, which was the name given to the study, and we had a 2-month exhibit appearing at the State Museum in Indianapolis, which we had a very nice reception and opening. And I think this is another thing, is it gets our student work exposed, and this is very important when we're trying to build a college and draw top-notch students. And also, since we're a state institution supported by tax dollars, it's always nice to show the citizens where their tax dollars are going in terms of supporting environmental instruction. We also were able to get an issue of the Indiana Architect magazine devoted to the first Indianapolis Inner City study. So I think for our first attempt, we kind of did fairly well. Through Dave Meeker, and now kind of Dave knowing of our students and what they could do, we were invited to take part in a charrette. A charrette is a term that's used around here. It means when students stay up anywhere between 48 and 96 hours in a row, walk around like zombies. It's basically a term that's been used since the mid-60s to talk about concentrated design involvement. The neat thing about it is that it involves the people who the facility will serve. In this particular case, it's the Model Cities neighborhood in Indianapolis, Indiana. A basic inner city neighborhood, originally white, working class, now 99.9% black. And I think those slides give you some idea of the basic environment. Of course, when you take slides on a rainy, dismal day, it adds a little bit of the, it kind of emphasizes the environment. The quote, human housing on the right is what they had torn down some really elegant old homes and replaced it with. Obviously, the people did not have any say into that housing. As a matter of fact, at that time, I think it was about 30% occupied, which was the most that it was. It started around 12%. People simply refused to move into it. The charrette was a 7-day concentrated involvement. It took place in an elementary school that was going to be replaced. And Model Cities got a grant from OEO, Office of Economic Opportunity, in order to fund this research, in order to fund this charrette. It took place in the gymnasium. They had workshops every day, started in the morning, approximately 9 o'clock, and ran till about 9 o'clock at night. The neat thing about it is that it involved people who I doubt had ever been involved in a process of designing a facility, and may very well have not been since. But at least for this 7 days, they were the designers. They were able to give input. And then we had Marv Rosenman and myself served on the steering group to organize our involvement from the very beginning. We also had 14 students and the head of the landscape program at that time, John Lancius and Dick Pollack. And what would happen is that these workshops would go on during the day. That's a gentleman named Snooky Hendricks on the left, and when Snooky said yes, things happened, and when Snooky said no, forget about it. You could do all the drawings in the world, nothing was going to happen. The gentleman in the center is Evans Woollen, who some of you know, Indianapolis architect, who had been commissioned to do the school. And you can imagine the position that Evans was in. The gentleman on the right is a black architect from Indianapolis who had been also then hired to take part in a team design with Evans Woollen. And I think the exposure of our students to this kind of experience is something that you simply cannot place a value on. It's a tremendous experience. What our students basically did was do a lot of listening during the day, and then we would basically start our work at about 9 o'clock in the evening after everybody else went home. And what we basically did was to, when I say we, mostly the students, was to produce the graphics that were necessary for the next day's workshops. And these rather large pieces of graphics were done in the evening, and then they were hung up in the gymnasium for the next day's critique and review and involvement. And you can see we were involved in everything, including the facility, which became expanded from an educational institution to a total community institution. We also got involved in how do you get people to and from this neighborhood. One of the neat things about urban design studios that involves citizens is you start with one idea, and about a week later you're doing absolutely a totally different thing, but it's what they feel is most necessary, and therefore as responsible urban designers and environmental designers, it's the thing that you become involved in. And in this case, they felt that the transporting of people that did not have automobiles was an absolute important, very, very important item for the functioning of the model city's neighborhood. This is some of the other things we did in terms of zoning and some suggestions for how an industrial area could be zoned away from proposed residential. One thing neat about architects is we know how to do some neat zoomy sketches, and it always impresses the people. They would come in the morning and eat their donuts and walk around and take a look at these. And in a sense, we were providing a service, and that's what we really went down there for. Our students provided and donated their time. The faculty donated our time. And we basically provided a necessary service to make the charrette a success. The last night, there was a 3-hour presentation. All of the graphics lined 3 walls of the gymnasium. Mike Cummings, who at that time was our only black student and a freshman, made a 2.5-hour presentation recapping the entire week's involvement and did an absolutely masterful job. I don't think I've ever been prouder of a student of ours than at that time when Mike, who was invited in actually about halfway through it, when they began to say, hey, don't you have any black students up there who want to be architects, came down, got involved, and made a tremendous presentation at the conclusion of the week's involvement. One thing about architects, when they do something well, we try to do it again. So we became involved. John Lancius established our first storefront studio with a group of landscape architects above Renee's Deli in Broad Ripple. It's also, I guess, a pretty good French restaurant. John and the landscape students did a study for a quarter in winter of 69-70 for the Broad Ripple neighborhood, which is north of Indianapolis. Basically, some broad scope strategies for how this almost self-sufficient neighborhood could grow and yet somehow limit the kind of blight that is beginning to even spread from the inner city to some of these surrounding neighborhoods. John that year also began the first of what now has become several White River studies with a urban design studio here in Muncie, basically studying the White River as it goes from Muncie down through Delaware County and through Anderson. We returned to Indianapolis the following fall quarter of 1970, trying to capitalize on our first experience, and did another inner city study. Not to bore you, we had some exciting projects that were totally different from the first years. Ken Tilbury studied the Penn Central tracks as they went through the inner city, did a rather interesting model here showing the kind of land use through a three-dimensional representation. We had a study of Stringtown, which is a residential area on the west side of the White River. Steve Willis proposed and did a study of the new outdoor stadium that has been talked of for several years if and when Indianapolis ever gets a professional football team. And the way they're going with their other teams, that may not be too far off. One project done by a team, Joe Minier and Terry Pastorino, decided to team up, and they combined to propose a sports arena downtown spanning Market Street and also a market restoration study. Now, these two projects had been talked about. There had been some studies done on their market restoration. The arena had been talked about. Some of those of you who remember the Pacers were threatening to go north in Marion County and build a stadium out in the boondocks, which would be serviced by a 2-lane gravel road, and there was a little bit of objection. Also, obviously, the DMD wanted the downtown for the revitalization that it would have in terms of drawing people to the downtown. Once again, Dave Meeker was a visiting critic, and so he and Don Perry were very happy that these two students. I want you to note the building that they proposed. It had a large space frame spanning Market Street with 2 flanking garages. One of the items that they proposed was some speculative office space that was included in that big black block, which was in the 4-story Vierendeel trusses that spanned Market Street. I think all of you know that if you go to Indianapolis now that there is a market, and Mayor Lugar used the student project to basically get the press release. Unfortunately, it was superseded by those headlines, but our students did get front page billing in a Sunday edition of the Indianapolis Star. And just yesterday, I happened to attend the circus at Market Square Arena. The student project got published in one of the brochures trying to stimulate some private financing. And of course, the Market Square Arena as it stands now spans Market Street and, as you well know, has flanking garages. Obviously, one of our students upon graduating was hired by the 4 firms that actually had a consortium to do the project. And although this certainly is not our student project, I think the students gave the first basic 3-dimensional notion that you could put an arena this size on those 2 blocks, that you could let Market Street go through. From an urban design point of view, I think the fact that it closes off Market Street on the east the way the state capitol does on the west is probably its greatest urban design positive amenity or positive input to the downtown. That same year, Dan Young, professor of landscape architecture, was involved in Portland, Indiana. Portland is the county seat of Jay County, and basically became involved in the Courthouse Square as there were 6 landscape students at that time. He then, as a private landscape architect, undertook one of the proposals, which was a kind of redevelopment of one of the alleyways that went through from the block immediately adjacent to the courthouse. And these are some pictures, the model on the left and the executed alley development on the right. And this was our first involvement in small town Indiana, was Dan Young and the landscape architect's involvement in Portland, Indiana. We returned to Indianapolis for another study. We narrowed it down to the Market Square development in the autumn quarter of 71-72. Once again, Don Perry, Dave Meeker, and myself as critics. Our students proposed, of course, restoration of the market and a multifunctional complex, including office space, a hotel, parking facilities, and some expansion of the market facilities themselves. And these are some of the drawings that were done. These are single student projects. I think you all know that this project is underway. Dean Sappenfield and myself attended the groundbreaking in September of '75. And of course, our student involvement was acknowledged. It is one of many studies, many thousands of man-hours, and by many, many professionals have gone into this. We're not saying, again, this is only our student projects, but I think our students were very instrumental. As you see, Don Perry, along with James Associates, are the restoration and project architects, and here are some pictures of that project as of last Wednesday. You can see the bridge that spans from the arena, spans Alabama, and some of the second-level walkways which will have glass enclosure. We were just completing that study when Bob Sorrells, who was a graduate of the Urban and Regional Studies program here at Ball State, called me up. He had been informed by Al Grinsfelder, a Fort Wayne architect who I had met when he visited our college. And this is how our urban design studios have grown, is by really word of mouth. Al Grinsfelder told Bob Sorrells, and Bob Sorrells said, hey, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit housing corporation operating in the East Central neighborhood of Fort Wayne. Would you and your students like to become advocate planners? Well, When I hear about becoming advocate planners for inner city neighborhoods, I really get excited, and so we committed 14 students and myself to a quarter, basically to attempt to give this nonprofit housing corporation a strategy and a direction to continue their rehab work. What this group had done is they had gone out and gotten a $100,000 no-interest loan from Lincoln Life Insurance Corporation of Fort Wayne. With that, they would buy homes in this East Central neighborhood, and that's the map of the East Central neighborhood. For those of you that know Fort Wayne, IIT is located there, and it's obviously East Central is the neighborhood immediately east of the downtown area. They had bought houses anywhere from payment of back taxes to as low as $300, or some of them were simply obtained by negotiating with the city for $1, and they would put anywhere between $8,000 and $10,000 back into the house, put them on the market for approximately anywhere between $9,000 and $12,000. So they were still within the range of low-income families, and they had gotten tied into some federal programs for subsidized housing and subsidized rent. Well, what they were doing were buying houses on a rather shotgun basis, one here, one there, and just with that kind of an approach, what you have is a very nice house on a very lousy block. And they began to see failure. Even after 3 years, they began to realize that those houses were not surviving because of being isolated rehab structures, and so what they needed was an overall strategy. Well, we went in there. It's basically a 90-block neighborhood. We, as I always do, I will simply not go into a neighborhood, nor do I hope our students, and say, well, the problem is really to do some studies of blocks. You kind of go back to the beginning. We studied the relationship of the East Central neighborhood. One of their problems is that 2 state routes come barreling right through the neighborhood. And this is approximately 330 traffic through a major residential street. Real nice to have a 4-year-old kid playing ball on a stoop when you've got that truck barreling down. It's just some major problems that go far beyond housing. We studied land use. Some of this information was available from City Hall, others we did by field survey. The land use varies greatly from nice residential streets to industrial. The site is bounded by the Maumee River on the north. It's bounded by the Penn Central Railroad tracks on the south, by the CBD on the east, and Anthony Avenue on the west. I'm sorry, reverse that. CBD on the west, Anthony Avenue on the east. We studied the building conditions. We surveyed each building in representative blocks, and again, the range was great, all the way from some really very nicely restored older homes to homes that actually were health hazards and should have been torn down for safety's sake. We studied open space and some rather unique things. As you well know, mid-city or Midwest cities have a mid-block system most of the time, which in this particular case sometimes went for 12 blocks unobstructed. And the Maumee River gave a very, very pleasant touch of rural America right in the middle of Fort Wayne. These were amenities that we attempted to capitalize on in our plans. We studied the public facilities, what were available. School facility located, the East Central neighborhood, the housing corporation operated out of the church that you see on the slide on the right. We studied the service systems, the public utilities, and of course, we always want to interview the local users. And so we were able to obtain the services of these 2 dogs who followed us to let us know how the fire hydrants were in the neighborhood. We studied the economic base, who owned the land, and interestingly enough, 2 or 3 banks were major slum landlords, which is the kind of information that as advocate planners you like to lay out on the table. We also, of course, dealt with some of the housing and the housing sale rates and transiency rates. We dealt a lot with the demographic information, trying to figure out who lived here, what was their economic base, what was their education level, all the rest of the things that the architects normally don't like to do. We would much rather as sociologists do that, or urban planners, but in this particular case, we were only architects, so we did it. Most importantly, we try to find out something about the people, all the way from the smallest residents of the neighborhood who were really great. We never did not have a group follow us around on field survey. Obviously, when you're white college students in a predominantly black neighborhood, you do attract the local residents. You try to find out something about what the people do, who are they, where they spend spare time, what are their goals and aspirations, why are they living where they are. We also attempt in our own very ignorant way to say something about the social structure of the neighborhood. Where are the gathering places? Where's the hub? Who calls the shots? where does the man operate? And in this particular neighborhood, the man comes in the car with the flashing red lights. And when you're white, in a sense, you are the man also. I might say that you've got to have a person like Bob Sorrells who is able to give you a feel for the neighborhood, and that's very critical in an urban design studio in an inner city. We also, of course, kind of try to get a feel for what projects were being proposed in and around the neighborhood. We also looked at this housing stock that we were originally called upon to help save, and there's really some beautiful housing in this neighborhood. As I said, it was a blue-collar neighborhood basically for the workers who worked in the breweries, which Fort Wayne had a fair amount of in the early 1900s. And some of the housing is really well done and well kept. It has the kind of detailing that architects just go crazy over. It's the kind of detailing that you can no longer get. It's existing, it's deteriorating, and it must be saved. When's the last time you were able to specify that kind of glasswork in a new residence? And of course, we attempted to give them some overall strategies for their neighborhood, dealing with transportation, with basic blocks that should be first in an attempt to gather land and then renew an entire block. We also got down to showing them some prototypical approaches to blocks where the center space could be used, where you would have to go through every block, evaluate that block, remove the buildings which are beyond, economically at least, beyond rehabbing, and the way on the right, new housing could in fact fit into an old neighborhood if a sensitive designer dealt with scale, spatial organization, detailing, so on and so forth. We were very happy. We were invited, and we gave the major presentation at the 1972 Allen County Housing Conference. And it was really nice that the East Central neighborhood got top billing for, I think you can probably imagine, this is the neighborhood that City Hall says, oh yes, they're out there, and we hope to hell they keep pretty quiet. This is an election year. And so we felt quite good that, in a sense, we could somehow be spokesmen in this particular situation. The greatest thing we did, I think, are not the plans and not the drawings, but we actually got groups of people who had never spoken to each other before, and I know this sounds amazing, but groups of people who were all going their own way, from a community center on the left to a major educational institution in the center to a Fort Wayne Urban League offering social and legal services on the right. And these people were all doing really neat stuff, and they thought they were the only ones. And somehow as third-party people, you can come in there and attempt to get some of these people to at least talk to each other. Following that, I did one little study with some third-year students on the expansion of the East Wayne Street Center, incorporating a new child care facility under the Neighborhood Facilities Grant Program at that time. And these were some pictures of some models that we presented to the East Central neighborhood. The winter of 72-73 saw a return to small-town Indiana. John Russell, who is chairman of our landscape architecture program, Bill Kintz, Craig Mullins from architecture, and Shirley Singer, who used to be with the art department, joined up into and joined their 4 sections and studied Wabash, Indiana, which is the capital or county seat, I should say, of Wabash County. Kind of a typical small-town Hoosier city. It does have some natural features like a river running through it, and these are some shots from the air showing the kind of density, basically 1- and 2-story single-frame structures beyond the downtown area. Again, small-town Indiana is rich with architecture, and all you've got to do is look for it. Both from its county courthouse to some of the downtown buildings to some of the residential structures which immediately surround the downtown. Here's a case where John and Bill and Craig and Shirley invited community people to come here, and a series of workshops were held here in the design studios involving chamber members, Chamber of Commerce members, and other local citizens. And this, you know, again, you can go out into the community, you can also get the community into here, and I think both are very effective measures. Obviously, sometimes you have to meet on their turf, so to speak, and sometimes you can get them to meet on yours. These are some of the slides of work sessions, which are very important. Once again, that group dynamics I spoke about earlier. And here are some of the products that went all the way from a transportation study on the left to an interesting study of the strip as you enter Wabash, to a proposal for a recreation center by Steve Borden on the right, which incorporates some existing structures and some new construction as well. Is that the change of first tray? Okay. While this was going on in the winter quarter of 72-73, Methodist Hospital from Indianapolis, Indiana, contacted Frank McGee, who at that time headed up our urban studies program. There should be a black slide, the first one. That's okay, leave it. How about going the other way? Gee, you're ruining my act. Telling me, showing them that beautiful. Thank you very much. Is that Barrett? Barrett, you've got really nimble fingers. Winter of 72-73, as I said, 14 urban and regional studies students and Professor Frank McGee were contacted by Jeff Lefko, who was head of Methodist Hospital planning at that time, and they undertook a study of the Methodist Hospital neighborhood in Indianapolis, approximately a 75-block neighborhood bounded by the inner loop on the south, I-65 and Fall Creek on the west, Fall Creek on the north, and Meridian Street on the east. Methodist Hospital is pictured. It is the 5th largest privately operated hospital in the United States, by far the largest in Indiana. The neighborhood, once again, developed around the turn of the century, a middle-class, blue-collar neighborhood, some really fine structures, both multiple family and single-family detached wood frame. Once again, a neighborhood that is now approximately 50 to 60 years old, and through natural growing old has reached a point where they are at a very, very important time in whether you can rehab it or not. Some other pictures, some really interesting row housing on the left, which is not very common to the Midwest at this period of development. Meridian Street, of course, is its own animal, and it kind of rams through this neighborhood. For the most part, has very little influence on it, except for some porno shops and various other places of business. What's really interesting is, once again, this rather quaint rural atmosphere on the north and northwest boundary provided by Fall Creek. Well, Frank McGee and 14 students undertook a rather massive study of this neighborhood and did the usual kinds of research and inventory that are needed in order to understand the neighborhood. Did a rather great job, we think, in the demographic area and in some of the information on employment, education level, so on and so forth. But the quarter ends, and when you're running urban design studios, 10 weeks goes rather rapidly. The hospital was really pleased with their work, was not pleased that it was over, and so Frank McGee and Jeff Lefko called me up and said, would you like to become involved? Yes, obviously the answer. I looked at the project, and one of the things I'll mention at the end of this is some kind of guidelines. You've got to be realistic in what you can do, and I thought that this project necessitated a full-time involvement. So we went to the Methodist Hospital with a proposal, and they funded us to the tune of $17,000 to run a full-time summer studio. The studio, they gave us the money to pay my salary, to pay student stipends. We had a storefront studio, which is shown here. The 6 students were Ron Miller on the left. Ron Miller was one of the original urban studies students. Don Rothenberg, an architecture student. Leanne Jacoby, an urban regional studies student, who is right now at Rutgers getting a degree in urban law. On gentleman in the center, you know, the gentleman next to me is Bill Jensen, who had just graduated and stayed on, thankfully, for the quarter. Pat Murray, second from the right, who was also part of the original team, and Steve Absher, who was a third-year student. They gave us the ground floor. It's imperative to have a ground floor studio if at all possible. We set it up. It's an old bar room from a hotel. We had red carpet and really a fantastic studio, great light through the windows. As you can see, some of the working, there's always a joker in every crowd. It was a totally sealed space, and we didn't have air conditioning for the first 3 weeks in July in Indianapolis, and it was a swelter. Don also had exhibition tendencies, so, you know, it worked out real well. We set it up, I ran it like an office. We set up a rigid time schedule, which we stuck to, and when you're getting money for it and you say you deliver a product, you deliver it. We spent a lot of time organizing the graphics. The first thing we did was we took all of the graphics that the urban studies students had done in color and acetate. We did them in black and white so that they could be printed at a reasonable cost at a later date, and that alone was a rather massive logistical job. We also undertook a program of educating the hospital staff, and I think being an educator, I consider every time you're involved in a community, you're there educating the community. In this case, it was interesting. We were educating hospital administrators about hospitals. It seemed a little bit odd at the time, but if one looked at the growth of Methodist Hospital, it was obvious that they could at least stand the refresher course in some of the new thinking about hospital expansion, including systematized and industrialized components, interstitial space, and some of the rather, I think, commonplace thinking that we've come to realize is important when you're dealing with something as changeable as the medical profession and medical care. We also showed them that their situations were not any more unique than any other cities, and showed them what other towns had done in terms of finding sites in a rather dense inner city neighborhood, how old housing and new housing could work hand in hand, and borrowing on Newman's work on defensible space, the number one priority of the hospital was security. Security when you're dealing in inner cities, and surprisingly enough, that was the number one item in the minds of the neighborhood residents as well. It's a high crime neighborhood, and we began to talk about how the physical environment could either help security or in many ways actually create a rather hostile environment and one easy for crime. We did a hell of a lot of preliminary work. We presented 6 initial concepts about how the hospital could expand and how it could take an active or a passive role as a catalyst for community development. We finally wound up presenting 2 schemes in final form. I think one thing's important as urban designers is to present options. Give the choice finally to the users, to the people. So we presented 2 schemes. Scheme A, basically the hospital would remain as a self-contained entity, not really concerned about the neighborhood. Obviously, we showed this because we made the hospital make a decision, and we thought that was quite important after we thought feeling out the group dynamics of the situation. Some schematic drawings on the left, a final plan drawing on the right, and model on, center and model on the right. Scheme B, in which the hospital takes an active part in neighborhood redevelopment, and working hand in hand with the city would go in a mutual redevelopment of the neighborhood, including a new K-8 elementary school and community center that would span 21st Street and would link the existing residential neighborhood to the hospital. A lot of the support staff of the hospital live in this neighborhood, and we felt that we could begin dealing with walking to work and dealing with redeveloping new infill housing, that we would be at least proposing a strategy for the revitalization of the housing stock as well. The furthest we went were some what I would call urban design framework suggestions for housing, some basic zoning back from the streets. Once again, proposing a rather old and ancient American custom of commercial land use on the ground floor and the shopkeeper living above, which has been done for centuries in Europe and was done throughout the 1800s and early 1900s in this country. And now, once again, environmental designers in their infinite wisdom are beginning to once again get back into multi-use structures after zoning all but eliminated that kind of use. And so this is where we ended, and I think for 10 weeks, actually, we did a hell of a lot of work. The Ball State study was presented. We presented it 3 times to the Lilly Endowment. We made several proposals to the hospital trustees and to community groups, and the Plan B was officially adopted as the 25-year growth strategy for the hospital and the neighborhood. Right now, there is a joint effort on the part of the city and architects hired by the hospital to kind of take our plan further. Some things have also gotten done at the hospital since '73 that some cases followed our suggestions and other cases didn't. The I'm a step ahead of myself, I'm sorry. Immediately, once you do an urban design project of this magnitude, you have information you cannot believe. It takes storage rooms, and it's foolish to waste all of that research and inventory. So I did a union building with some third-year architecture students. Claire Monk and a group of research students, both architects and landscape architects, did a demographic study of the neighborhood, on-site survey of the residents. And I did some urban design modeling, three-dimensional aspatial modeling with an urban design section in 74, 75. Harry Egging and some students took a closer look at that educational community center that was a major link across the streets. One of our major proposals to the hospital was to no longer consider the street system as a deterrent. In other words, the grid that the cars go on, the street system, occurs on the ground plane. You do not, above or below that, have to consider that as a definer for buildings. In other words, bridging of streets above and below grade level would be a way to begin to break the confines of the city block. And we're happy to see that some of the buildings built since a private development with James Associates as architects have built this office building immediately across from the hospital. Our suggestion to link this building above grade was followed. It was already in the discussion phase when we began the project. The notion of using the inner block for parking garages and then the periphery of the block for buildings was also followed. This building, the parking garage is behind it. The slide in the center, the parking garage is on the right of that kind of mastaba or trapezoidal shaped building, and the parking garage does function off of the mid-block alley, or mid-street rather, which was one of our urban design suggestions. Something that's made me very happy, we suggested a unifying graphic system. They had graphics all the way from 1895, when the first building was built, to the last building that was built in 1973, and every architect simply did a little bit more graphics. The 1895 building had solid bronze, graphics, beautiful tablets saying such and such a pavilion, and of course the later buildings had vinyl and aluminum. Well, we suggested an overall unified graphic system, and I'm happy to report that that system has been accomplished by a privately hired architectural and industrial design firm. And I think, as you can see, I think they've done a very, very nice job on the graphics, which is both on the exterior as shown here, and they are now beginning a total unifying and unification graphics on the interior of the building. When you're dealing with 1,250 bed hospital, that is a monumental task. So we feel quite good about our involvement in Methodist Hospital. The following winter, 73, 74, we had planning students and landscape students and architecture students return to small town Indiana. And Decatur, county seat of Adams County, was this time the city that contacted the college. Wally Van Zyl, who initially headed up the planning program, Bob Beauregard, planning faculty, John Russell, landscape chairman, and Harry Egging from the architecture department all had a multidisciplinary team to study this small Midwestern town, once again centered around a Courthouse Square and the typical kind of 2- and 3-story commercial buildings, approximately 2 blocks on either side, and then, of course, into the more basic residential areas surrounding that. They call the project Decatur Options. I think options are a very good word. That's what we're about in urban design studios, providing options for local people to make some decisions on. And here are some of the graphics that were produced, basically involving transportation and circulation to downtown, some suggestions for the removal of buildings which were beyond repair, some institution of mid-block passageways, some proposals for phasing of mid-block alley landscape work and beginning to turn the alleyways into an amenity as opposed to a liability, which most of them are at the present time. And I think probably one of the more interesting schemes was a project for a proposal. It was time to get some education, so he left school for 9 months. Major rallying points for Indiana towns and cities. A Bluffton native. I always say this about Craig. I think Craig decided it was time to get some education, so he left school for 9 months. And in turn, he was employed by United Telephone Company under their Project Proud, in which they support designers to work with communities interested in revitalizing their downtown. Craig became involved in the downtowns initially of Decatur and Walkerton. Since then, he's been involved in LaGrange and several other communities. And the work you will see is that solely done by Craig Leonard. He began to deal again with community groups. In this particular case, I believe mostly merchants. Some of the items that they became involved in was the restoration of the shop fronts, some of the graphics that he produced. He then supervised the actual restoration work, and I think if you look from the slide from the left to the right, I think you will see that in this particular case, the person that can stick with it finally gets results which are rather pleasing. Once again, his involvement was only from the sign line up. And this is very critical. You will see later on in Marion, where we've been involved. In order to deal with the shop fronts themselves is very expensive, and you get into a whole other realm of involvement. Here's another very, a building on the left, except if you wanted a drink, who would ever look at that building? And yet, again, with a sensitive designer, which Craig is, you can see the results of a sensitive restoration project on the right. And I think these slides here tell the story. The one in the center, when you can find a client that's willing to go all the way, including new awnings and graphics. The sign on the left showing Craig's rather intricate and concern for detail. And these are researched colors from the Victorian era. And of course, on the right is a slide that is worth 100,000 words, a before and after. When you get one merchant to pop and one not to pop, that's what basically happens. Actually, we hadn't even started school in September of '74 when we became involved in the RUDAT project in Lafayette. RUDAT is Regional Urban Design Assistance Teams. They're sponsored by the American Institute of Architects and funded from local sources. In other words, cities that wish to have an assistance team come in and take a fresh look at some of their problems. We, Notre Dame and Purdue, all donated students and faculty. I'm happy to say I think that the Ball State students by far provided the greatest service. The 6 professionals who came in are pictured in the center slide. Ron Straka on the left, who was the head of the urban design assistance teams nationally for the AIA. Johnny Desmond, Baton Rouge architect, and all of whose drawings are those beautiful single line ink drawings. Bill Harrelson, who's an economist from Chicago. John Oldham, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, urban designer from Washington, D.C. Joe Passanow, originally St. Louis, and now Washington, D.C. urban designer. I believe he used to head up the Washington University School of Architecture at one time in St. Louis. And Jerry Prather, St. Louis, who was an urban lawyer who was very interesting to work with. The RUDAT program, as I mentioned, sends teams like this in. In the particular case of Lafayette, it was to study railroad relocation that had been studied since 1925 when the first proposal was done. Lafayette, again, it's a county seat. It has railroad tracks running right through the downtown. This is the one on 5th. Those are railroad tracks, active railroad tracks in the center slide. Some really rather nice residential areas, and if you have a kid that loves trains, it's a beautiful place to live. A farmer's market there on the right. You know, your kid can go on the front step and see the 502 come by. You really can't beat it. Once again, I think I speak for the students, I speak for myself. I think the ability and the opportunity to work hand in hand in a situation like this, one-on-one with these professionals and with the citizens groups. They had an old bank that had been abandoned and then had been turned into a restaurant, and some zoomy architect who couldn't stand to leave beautiful walls alone had to put a little bit of super graphics on it. But this banking hall is where we had the RUDAT charrette or studio. And I fulfilled one of my lifelong dreams, riding up and down a railroad track in a little red caboose with all of our students. We really had a rather, actually we worked almost 72 hours in a row with very little sleep. Brandy Gaskins, Don Abel, Harry Moeller, and Mike Warden, and Gary Bollier, Steve Turnipseed, who is now on our faculty, all volunteered their time actually during their summer vacation, because this was before school had started. One of the great things is, again, that our students get to talk hand in hand, or first hand rather, with these people. Dan Fogarty, pictured on the left, is a Ball State graduate who is assistant to Kent Schutte, who was on our faculty and is now the redevelopment director of Lafayette. The gentleman on the right is the center slide shows Steve Turnipseed and Randy Gaskins in the caboose, and the gentleman on the right is the mayor of Lafayette, who spent one entire day at the Roulette Charrette. What the final product was an 8-page newspaper that went to 35,000 citizens in Lafayette free of charge. And as far as I'm concerned, is the best Roulette booklet put out, because of the amount of people that got to see it. And these are some of the pages from that newspaper. Johnny Desmond sketches. I think it's interesting. I just want to read an excerpt from a letter that Ron Straka wrote to Dean Sappenfield following our involvement. And this is a paragraph. Only through this type of joint effort between the professions and our colleges and universities can we grow and build a stronger profession. Hopefully the school can play a role in the follow-up of the Roulette visit. And then he goes on to say, I would especially like to single out Steve. And Steve stayed a day after the charrette ended. We had all come back, and he basically single-handedly put together the newspaper, the final galleys and everything else. And he said, I would like to single out Steve for special recognition for his patience, help above and beyond the call of duty to come back Tuesday and make sure the report finally got put in order. Without his effort, the report would not have gotten out on time. Thanks again, Steve. Thanks again for a great job, Ball State University. And obviously it's these kinds of letters that make us very proud of our students who become involved. Well, we did follow Ron Straka's suggestion. John Russell and I and a group of landscape architectural students and architectural students returned to Lafayette in the fall quarter, and we followed up some of the suggestions, once again doing some additional work on railroad relocation. In the meantime, being a glutton for work, Marion, Indiana had called us up, and I ran a Marion urban design studio the same quarter that I ran a Lafayette urban design studio. And it's the last time I will ever run 2 urban design studios in the same quarter. I think people thought I owned a university car, as a matter of fact, because I spent a lot of time driving across the state north of here. Doug Marsh, who was the head of the Chamber of Commerce in Marion, Indiana, and is a Ball State Urban Studies graduate, and we're beginning to build up a nice network of people who know us, contacted us and said, hey, we understand you like to study small-town Indiana. And we once again studied Marion, Indiana, basically limiting ourselves to the CBD, the Central Business District. The Central Business District is centered around the courthouse, as you saw on the previous slides, is rather intact. Marion hasn't been as destructive as some other cities with post-World War II urban removal. It has a lot of its downtown, and its Courthouse Square is totally intact, although the buildings range from being in fairly good condition to, as you see on the left of the center slide, a modern storefront. And on the right, you can see that the Courthouse Square is a rather hodgepodge of parking, walkways, and the typical problems of a downtown city. We once again went back to ground zero, basically starting with the floodplain problem. The Mississinawa River runs through. It's interesting how these cities have some things that occur over and over again, and many Indiana cities were founded on rivers for obvious reasons. So we began by studying some of the environmental implications. Of course, we studied traffic, one of the major problems of any city, both the county implications and through routes, as well as some of the local implications. The map on the right shows the amount of land that is devoted to parking the automobile. Some of the building survey, this was all first-hand field survey. Every single building is done. Land use, a building survey showing condition of the building and the density. We became involved with building status, basically who occupies the building, what are the public facilities, and what is the open space. The open space is in the white and the built buildings are in the black on the slide on the right. We became involved in some of the proposed zoning. You always go into a town and find out what's on the books, and many times it's very little and sometimes it's fairly current. One of our students who was interested in business and economics did a fairly detailed study of downtown tax structure and some of the problems, some of the land values, where the land was going up or down in value, and obviously some of the reasons why developers would rather go out into a soybean field to build a commercial development and not into our downtowns because of the penalization from the tax structure. Also a study of the economic profile. The merchants had done some studies to show how many dollars left Marion to go to Fort Wayne, to Indianapolis, and even the Muncie Mall for shopping. We proposed some goals and objectives here shown. We try to get our architectural students to do some writing, some of the goals and objectives that were stated following the research, and some basic overall urban design strategies, including traffic proposals, including in the center, Carol Marion, who's here this evening, thank you for coming, a proposal about some basic usage groupings of the downtown, some legal centers around the courthouse, a commercial and a recreation. And the projects normally wind up with an individual project shown on the right, basically involved with some urban graphics, some signage, and some building rehab. This project by Don Powell really, I think, played an important role looking back because he isolated the Courthouse Square. And following this project, we decided one of our final recommendations was that the Courthouse Square should be a demonstration project. They should put all of their effort and financial resources into the Courthouse Square to get the thing started. And so, based on our Indianapolis Model City charrette, our 4-day RUDAT involvement, we proposed a 1-day charrette. And I kind of thought that our students could do it, and I'll let you judge for yourself what can be done in 1 day. We concentrated on the Courthouse Square. The 1-day charrette was held here in the I&M building in the large glass room which fronts out onto one of the main streets. Prior to that day, there was some work done. Norm Lingerman, staff photographer, and myself photographed all of the buildings that front or, in a sense, make up the Courthouse Square. We did black and white 8x10 sheets of each of the buildings. We then began on the 10th of July to have a meeting. This started at 9 o'clock in the morning. We held a basic organizational meeting. Every single merchant and landowner on the Courthouse Square was invited, and those aren't the same. We had about an 80% turnout, which is phenomenal. And we started with a general meeting over coffee and donuts in the morning. We showed some slides of their own city. Once again, the modern solution on the left, some out-of-control super graphics in the center. I'll tell you, I love super graphics, but I hope that they pass on because they can be beautiful and they can also be just really damn destructive, as shown when you get some fairly insensitive super graphics. But at least they could see it. And we didn't pull any punches. We told them that I know they had paid a lot of money for that painting, but we didn't think it was very good. Luckily, Garrel Guy, who is a Marion architect, that is his office on the right, and I think shows a rather sensitive approach to using an older building in the downtown, and that's Garrel's office there. We showed them some work. The slide in the center you'll recognize. It's one that Craig Leonard had used. We showed, I'm sorry for the dark slide, some notion about unification of graphics, and your sign doesn't have to be the biggest to be the best. On the right, we showed what simply cleaning up all of the residue off the buildings had done in some other cities. And we historically showed them that the canvas had been used as the basic awning on the street, not the Reynolds aluminum that had become so prevalent. We also kind of gave them a series of conclusions. Number one, that the basic color of their downtown was tan, was beige. Now that seems like, pretty simplistic until you really look and you say, gee, people said, yeah, I guess you're right. A lot of the buildings are of a buff earth color. And this is where we started. We kind of grabbed onto that as a major design constraint. we set about working, including yours truly, Donnie Powell in the center, Wayne Norland on the right, Don Abel on the left, Wendell Adams, all of who were fifth-year students. And at the suggestion of some freshman crits, we got Tom Jeffs, who at that time was a freshman student, who is shown on the right. What we basically did is we gave every merchant a designer for an hour, and they sat down and they talked with designers, and we did some sketches, and what we came up with were some graphics, basically before and after. And you can see the drawings here on the left, the before photographs, the after. Now, this is a before shot and that's an after. That's what happens when a merchant will not follow the color guide. This is what we had proposed. It's a hell of a lot better than that, but we felt that this is one of those things when you're not in control of implementation. I certainly think it's an improvement. However, we did accomplish some things. This was some suggestions for this building, trying to tie in, carry over. We're sorry all the green didn't go, but once again, I think it's a step in the right direction. This seems like a rather mundane building here. What's interesting is what was uncovered by our students, and once again, in our suggestions over here in the before and after, it's incredible what had been painted over. Look at this scroll work done here in plaster. And people said, do you mean that that was really up there all this time? And we said, yeah, only for about 45 years. And you know, that's what every one of the Indiana cities has. And if they would kind of get the grime out and show it. This is the only block that wasn't accomplished. Donnie Powell did this. It's obviously the best of the design work. It obviously would take the most major financial investment to convert this up here into this, but maybe in the future that will be realized. Well, it's interesting what has happened in Marion. The wonderful snowball is rolling, and it's rolling on buildings that we haven't even proposed, like this one here, which Garrow Guy has now taken over and is doing some recommending of some rehab work. Even this building here, which has been done, at least the aluminum awning that gets you in the forehead is gone, and whether you like the graphics or not, it's certainly, I think, an improvement over the original. We've moved off the Courthouse Square. This building is about 2 blocks away. All the signage has been brought into a common strip, and we think rather nicely done, once again following some guidelines that the one-day charrette established. Garrow Guy has done, in this case, the reverse. The merchant was willing to pop for the storefront and didn't do anything up above. But once again, I think a rather tasteful handling of the signage and the basic graphic line above the storefronts done by Garrow Guy. And some neat graphics has been done. The one on the left is a store selling toys, and I think that the handling of the windows is really well done. What was a blank wall on a parking lot, I also think. We think our greatest achievement, though, was this. The architect who was hired to redo this vacant store took one of my classes in Indianapolis, a girl who was working for a store design firm. And she said, hey, would you mind, you know, talking to me about what your proposals are? And we said, well, we're basically involved in trying to stick with tans and natural colors, and we'd like to reintroduce some canvas awnings. And I think she's done a rather great job of it over there. So now, in that one block at least, instead of looking at this, you now look at that. And I think for a one-day charrette, as they say in Brooklyn, that ain't too bad. This past year has been an active one. I guess we always keep trying to do one better. Al Wallace and Don Perry were over in Winchester, Indiana, doing a downtown study, which was carried out with a lot of local input. Also, this past year, we devoted a major part of our entire college, not just urban design, to the Muncie past, present, and future. And I am not going to show any slides because after the lecture, you're free to walk throughout the exhibition space where the project is on display. I guess they can change. We're coming down the home stretch. Our latest project has been one that has now gone on the longest of any urban design project. and that is our Centreville, Indiana Urban Design Studio. It started last November when Ted Panazis, who is the head of State Planning Services Agency, called me up. And as you know, New Harmony, Indiana is very famous for its historical work, restoration, preservation, adaptive reuse work, along with some growth strategy. And they've won a HUD award. And when I had a class in Indianapolis in Ted's office, I said, the next time you get a project like that, don't go and get an architect from New York, which they had done, actually landscape architects from New York City. I said, why don't you come, and Ball State will do just the same job, as a matter of fact, a much better one. Well, Ted is one of my kind. He kind of doesn't forget those things, and so he called me up and he said, Centreville, Indiana would like you to, or Centreville, Indiana is interested in doing a historical project. Centreville, Indiana is a little town of 2,400 people, 2,380, on US 40, approximately 6 miles due west of Richmond on US 40. It's a quaint little town, platted in 1814, and it is a town that is extremely rich in its history, both its physical environmental history as well as the history of people that have been citizens of the town. We, in a sense, interviewed for the project. We went to Centreville, we took a look at it. Being from the east, I couldn't believe that this actually existed in the Midwest, buildings right up on the sidewalk, row houses and all of that. It's a really interesting city, and we kind of interviewed and we showed the Centreville Town Council or Board of Trustees, as well as Historic Centreville, which is a private historical group, what we had done, and they voted to accept us as their planning consultants. The first step, of course, was to study Centreville, to take a look at it. There are some very famous buildings in Centreville, the Oliver P. Morton residence. Morton, of course, was the governor of Indiana during the Civil War. The Lance Row Center. The arch is the kind of most unique feature of Centreville. When the National Road was narrowed from its original 100 feet to 65 feet, land speculators sold the extra 35 feet and buildings were built in front of the original buildings. The builders were smart enough to allow passage to the buildings beyond, and so these arched openings allow you to walk through to get to the buildings in the interior of the blocks, and thus the famous Centreville Arch became known. The Mansion House on the right is a 3-story, as you see, brick-bearing structure from the 1820s. It was a National Road hostel. It had borders and a liquid refreshment on the ground floor for the weary travelers. Centreville was the St. Joe, Missouri of the 1820s. The National Road, for the most part, stopped here, and the wagon trains were made up to then go west. Later on, of course, it went to St. Louis and finally to St. Joe. And so Centreville really thrived in the 1820s and early 1830s. Since then, obviously, only 2,380 people. It hasn't actually been your booming metropolis. What is great is that not only do famous buildings remain, but some rather typical buildings, like this workers' housing, a duplex on the left. And this is the kind of housing that America discards, that we don't have enough of remaining. Historically, of course, we've always removed the typical kind of environment. We've always maintained the very famous building, the cathedral, the city hall, the merchants' buildings that were famous. But we take housing down rather rapidly. It's interesting to have a house from the 1825s, which was typical workers' housing, and to see how little 2 families got by with in those days. Some rather nice buildings from the later 1800s on the center and the right. There are also some problems in Centreville. Obviously, US 40 comes ramming right down the main street. In some infinite wisdom of some real estate developer, what was the landscaped front lawn of the Morton residence now has a laundromat. It used to have a gas station until the Lilly Endowment gave $6,000 to get it removed. This lawn was in perfect condition until the mid-1950s. And then this was built in the front yard of the governor's house, who was the governor of your state in the Civil War, which just leads you to believe that economics do in fact play a little bit of a role in the shaping of our cities. On the right is the wonderful parking lots that are now in the center of the blocks in Centreville, Indiana, and yet we heard from the townspeople that off-street parking is one of their major needs. Very, very inefficient parking of cars. There's also some problems such as that wonderful new bank building where a very sensitive architect obviously studied the old Federal and Greek Revival architecture when he did the one-story hip roof building. Also, the very elegant Western store there with the aluminum awning, which took down 2 Victorian storefronts as well. And just some problems which are solvable, such as the buildings on the right, Morton's Row, which the Historic Centreville Incorporated owns, which are in fairly bad disrepair and obviously need to be restored to their original condition. I think in Centreville, I can safely say we have reached a tremendous involvement between the citizenry and the design team. The design team included myself and Bob Bloom, Luis Morales, Craig Leonard, and Bill Van Dusen. Bill left us at the end of May because he graduated, which is a good reason to leave. The other 3 have worked throughout the summer, and Bob Bloom, who will be finishing up thesis at the end of this quarter, remains on the team for fall quarter. Steve has joined this team for this quarter and will in fact be helping to do what I will talk about a little later, the newspaper for it. The Centreville Town Hall is a rather nondescript structure. It became our home away from home. This is where the life of the city of Centreville takes place. This is where the board meetings are held, and this is where the steering committee takes place. The steering committee included all the board of trustees of the town, all the plan commission members, all of Historic Centreville officers, and 2 high school students. And I think it was tremendously farsighted, to put 2 high school students on basically the citizens group or the citizen spokesman for Centreville. We started off with a series of meetings. You can see these meetings were held in the room there where above the door it says City Building. Not only are the formal meetings important, but it's the informal discussion that takes place before and after these meetings, which is also very, very important. We basically use that room as well for our on-site studio, although we didn't spend a whole tremendous amount of time down there at any one time. We would kind of go down and spend full days, namely Wednesdays, and we would use this as a base of operation. The lady in the center is Mrs. Alice Good, the clerk treasurer, which is the only kind of full-time city administrator that they have, and she was extremely helpful with some of the administrative and logistical kinds of setups that are needed for a project such as this. We did a lot of field work. We did a lot of field work in terms of actually for the structures. We field surveyed every single building in the town, and that takes a lot of time. And we also sought out human resources. That's Luis Morales talking with John Nixon, who is a 93-year-old resident, born and raised in Centreville, Indiana. And in that gentleman, you have one of the greatest resources in terms of the history of the town. We originally got a grant for $7,000 cash from the state, and Centreville matched it with in-kind contributions, no cash. So far, Centreville has not spent 1 penny on this project. Their total contribution has been in kind. In other words, they put a dollar value on their time spent at meetings and renting, in a sense, renting the space to us to use as a studio. We've generated almost $6,000 of in-kind, even though they only had to raise $3,500. The first part of the contract was to do base maps, which sounds very mundane, but there were no base maps available. The map on the right is the first, when I say none, there were very few. The map on the right is the first map ever locating every structure in Centreville, which is very useful when you want to do building-specific kinds of mapping and inventory. We did that by getting a 1971 aerial photograph from Craig Leonard's uncle, who works for the Department of Highways, and they had flown this in '71. We did it then by using the aerial photograph, and we field surveyed buildings built since that time, noting those which had been removed and those which had been built. Certain information, of course, was available, such as USGS maps, county zoning. Wayne County, by the way, does have a county zoning. Some of the stuff, such as a zoning map, was available, traffic volume counts for the Department of Highways. Some sewer inventory, although we did some ourselves, and some water inventory were available. All the rest of the information was done first-hand field survey. Land use, land values, which Craig Leonard spent many hours over in Richmond at Wayne County Assessor's Office taking off all the land assessment values. The map on the right I know sounds very mundane, but the capital improvements of their sidewalks ranked number 3 in terms of priority with the town council. So we walked every foot of sidewalk and rated them from good to excellent, needs minor repair, all the way to health hazard, needs total repair or total replacement. And this is very important. This again, if anybody would have said, what are you going to do down there last November? If I would have said, well, we're going to propose sidewalk capital improvements, you just don't know until you start dealing with the people. We did a lot of emphasis on the historic resources. We designated 101 structures as being of historic significance. We used a format developed by Historic Landmarks Foundation for the Department of Natural Resources. We also did some work in terms of stating state of preservation, building significance, and merit and image. An interesting thing developed. We went in there, and about 4 months into the project, we realized that there was a tremendous amount of hostility between Historic Centreville and the town council. And so we really backed off of the historic restoration work. We would present a growth strategy, present-day concern, and a historic concern at each meeting. It's kind of giving a cookie to each person. You give the chocolate chip to one, you give the coconut oatmeal for the other person. You keep them both happy. And I know this sounds, this is the notion of group dynamics. And there was real open hostility. It's interesting because we would say things as kind of third party, and after the meeting, people would come up to me and say, that's how to be said for the last 15 years, and nobody was willing to say it, and you said it. Well, when you don't have any economic interest in the town, when you have no family in the town, you can say just about anything you want, other than Centreville's a lousy town. And as third-party involvers, you can do this. Matter of fact, you must do this. You must be the stimulant. You must generate that kind of option. You must throw that out and say, hey, gang, Centreville is not that big. We've got to all kind of work together, a joint public-private involvement. Well, we had a series of meetings. We would always do rather large graphics that we would put up on the wall, and we kind of had talk sessions, and we always recorded the talk sessions. We did some recording on tape recorder, and that became more of a hassle than it was worth. So we did a lot of work in writing down comments right in front of them and then taking these big sheets of paper home. We addressed issues like what we did after the research is we stated what we considered to be strengths and weaknesses, and then we simply put down some of the comments from the local group for location, transportation, land use, housing, service systems, sewer, water, public facilities and services, historic resources, and public policies. We really became involved for the first time in the implementation phase. How could we get things done? And also, what makes the city tick? What were their legal documents already on board? What were they lacking? How was it organized? Where was it strong? Where was it weak? Again, more meetings. I guess we've held approximately 12 meetings now. We held them sometimes 2 weeks apart, other times 4 weeks apart. Again, we would always set the meeting date at the end of the previous meeting, and I would normally recommend a date, and I would recommend it after sensing how that meeting had gone. And sometimes I'd recommend a 2-week meeting, and sometimes I'd recommend a 4-week meeting. I call it sensing the pulse, and I think you've got to feel out where the constituency is at and how much can you bombard them at any one time. You also work around things like July 4th and Centreville days and the homecoming day and the local bazaar. You've got to kind of you've got to deal with the time schedule that the town is on. We then developed a series of design proposals, actually strategies, if you will, for annexation and growth, for the transport proposal for movement, parking, off-street parking, and sidewalk improvements, which got a loud rounding cheer from the town council. Capital improvements program, both the public and the private, and this is where it varies a little bit from what most planners would call capital improvements, namely the spending of public monies. We also talked about the private money. If you see the big red arrow, it says moving of the courthouse. That is the old Salisbury courthouse, which was moved from Salisbury to Richmond, and then was beneath the house for something like 80 years, and then it was moved here in the early 60s, and it's out in the 4-H grounds, and now they've lost their 4-H grounds. And so we recommended in one of our bolder moves, I know this sounds not very bold, but we recommended moving it to the park in town. And from the back of the room, Paul Hamilton jumped up, who's an artist and a lifelong resident, and he said, "I told them to put it in the park when they first moved it here from Richmond." So you see, we got at least one vote for that particular move. But this is kind of interesting, because we did that strictly on a fairly objective basis of where we thought it should be in terms of the greatest, first of all, for its own usage, and second of all, we feel that it is of such importance in terms of the history of Indiana and the Midwest that it certainly deserves a place in the town much better than a abandoned 4-H grounds. We proposed, as I said, some implementation strategies, some possible funding sources, and these were all drawings. You see them about 3 times their size, but that were up in front of the rooms for the meetings. The furthest we got, this is our historic package. We have proposed a historic zoning code, basically 2 districts, a historic commercial, historic residential. The large blue zone is the part of Centreville that is on the National Register of Historic Places, and I think it may very well be one of the largest areas to actually be on the National Register. The center is our capital improvements in basically the private sector for historic restoration, and a quick sketch of how you could organize the interior of the blocks for off-street parking and reuse the archways to get people from the parking back out onto the sidewalk, which we think is a neat way to kind of reinforce what was an original historic usage of the archways. Those are some of the photographs up above, and the before and after thing is a really neat thing. You know, you show people what's there now and they go, oh wow, that's what it could be, kind of, and you begin to learn to use some of these methods. Craig Leonard gave an excellent presentation about some of the future things, such as a guidelines for restoration, some of the work that we hope we can get into in the coming years. We got to a point in mid-August, and I called up Ted and I said, okay, Ted Panazis there, the gentleman who's head of state planning, I said, what's going to happen? Is this going to wind up with a book on a shelf? And he said, well, we've got a little slush money left over before the end of the year, and we'll extend the contract date till the end of November. So luckily, we've gotten almost another $4,000 for myself and to continue on this quarter. And this was the meeting at which we proposed, and the town had to vote whether to continue or not. And this sounds really funny, but there was a lot of discussion. In November, when we started, for 2 months, they actually backed off the project, so fearful of not generating local in-kind. And I sat down for a day and showed them how they could generate so much in-kind that they could redesign the world. But you let the community vote. And as soon as you begin to try to ram things down people's throats, you're going to get turned off. And this is something about trying again to sense the pulse of the city. So we are funded through November. Then, as I said, this was the meeting in which Ted Panazis presented the additional work. Well, came August, and we were set to do the final presentation. The 6th floor studio of this building became our production office. Craig Leonard, Luis Morales, Bob Bloom, and myself. These are some of the 38 final maps that were produced black and white on Mylar and then photo reduced. The tree cover map was also done off the aerial photograph, and then we field surveyed those trees which had been felled by storms since that time. No tree since '71 has grown significantly to rate being on the map. Again, one of the things I said about the final presentation, I said this is Holiday Inn night, there are no surprises. And obviously everything, and this is part of the contract, the community has to see every piece of information initially, you have to discuss it at another meeting, and then you have to take a vote on it at a third meeting. So there's no way that you can get kind of proposals or recommendations or strategies or conclusions in the final report without the town okaying it. And this okay has to come in writing after a formal motion, which is very nice because it demands public airing of all of the major problems. This is our basic 3 maps on the historic resources. This is our historic building index, the 101 structures, some of the incredible and lots of photographic work basically done by Craig Leonard, shown there in form in the center, and the Historic Landmarks Foundation form that we filled out on 101 structures on the right. This is what happens when you're coming down the home stretch on a final proposal, and at that time, even though you cannot find a stipend, you bring in some of the professional presentation people to help you. And this is my professional Mario, who came in and spent a number of hours probably making us laugh, which I think all of you know when you're coming down a charrette, the most important thing is to laugh a little bit. We turned out a 143-page final comprehensive plan. We found an 1874 atlas map with the old original spelling of Centreville. If you'll notice, the ER is reversed. And it's interesting that, you can see from 1874, a lot of the physical environment remains in Centreville. These are some of the pages from the book, just to show you some of the graphics. Whenever we had a map, we always had a facing page so that it was kind of a full fold-out leaf in terms of the graphics of the book. This is our historic district ordinance, which what I basically did is I found 4 ordinances that had been written for various parts of the country, took what I considered to be the hardest parts of each and made what I think is maybe the hardest of all of them. And I'll talk a little bit about what's going to happen with this. This is some of the historic. These are the pages from the inventory which we've included to show the way you rate a building on the inventory, or I should say record it. This is a basic 2-page sheet with the information on the left and a photograph on the right. Bob Bloom is going to do all 101 structures like we did these 10, I think, this quarter. This is the final book, the collation of it, which you're really happy when you get to this point in a project. And this is the final presentation, 1 September. The contract called for 31st August. We made it for a Wednesday evening. These are 4 out of the 5 board members there on the left. One thing I might mention, you noticed another newspaper article. We got fantastic coverage from the Crusader, which is the Centreville paper. It goes to approximately 85% of all families in Centreville. You must get the information to the people. Obviously, a steering committee does not represent everybody. They would announce when the meetings were, print the agenda sometimes, although I guess most of the times we didn't get an agenda to them because we never knew it until 5:30 of the day we were going to have a meeting at night. But we got tremendous cooperation from Mr. and Mrs. Rhodes. I'm happy to report that we are right now working on putting together an 8-page newspaper, a special edition of the Crusader, which will go out on the 7th of October. And in 8 pages, we are going to attempt, much like Lafayette Rudat, to condense and offer a succinct version. It's going to go to every household free of charge, and we're giving a copy to every student in grades 7 through 12. So we want to begin to get the residents of Centreville started in terms of their future planning very early. Some of you may recognize the gentleman in the white hair, that the emergency light is kind of going into the side of his head over there on the right slide. Or Lieutenant Governor came, and since it was a state agency, Lieutenant Governor Orr, very happily, I didn't find out until 7:45 the morning of 1 September that the Lieutenant Governor would be there. He came and he made a really tremendous presentation. That is us presenting volume or issue 1 to go to Bowen, and issue 2, we numbered them, there are 150. 1 of 150 went to Bowen, and 2 of 150 went to Lieutenant Governor Orr, and that is the write-up in the Richmond paper that we got the next day. And I might just say that the Lieutenant Governor actually was the prime mover in founding the State Planning Services Agency, and he gave about a 20-minute talk that was really tremendous to hear a public official at that level of state government being so knowledgeable about the planning process. His son is an architect, and his wife is a restorationist. She's not an architect, but she's very much involved in preservation, restoration, and he is very, very knowledgeable about historical preservation and restoration. As I said, Centreville will continue. I think in Centreville you kind of see where, at least for the urban design studios, where the state of the art is at present, at least the studios that I've been involved in. Obviously, when you get the funding, you can do just one hell of a lot more than if you don't get the funding in terms of turning out graphics, getting information to people, so on and so forth. Where are we at now? Well, this quarter, Tipton, Indiana is the scene of an urban design studio with Al Wallace and fourth-year urban design students. And Newcastle and Henry County is understudy by our graduate urban planning students with David Johnson and Malcolm McNair and Francis Parker, planning faculty, and I believe 7 or 8 urban and regional planning master's students. So I guess what we're really saying is that we simply keep going. We feel that the service is a needed one for the cities and the towns of Indiana. What you've seen are, it's a lot of graphics, it's a lot of information. I just want to kind of state a few things. Number one, I think there are some guidelines about urban design studios that are really important. I think that the communities have to understand what we're about, that the prime reason we're there is to educate our students. We're also there to service them. But as far as I'm concerned, if a decision has to be made as far as an objective for the education of our students versus an objective for the town, the educational objective will always take priority in any studio that I am involved in, and I think this certainly goes for other faculty as well. Secondly, a community has to understand that any project that goes beyond the initial planning phase has to be done by registered professional architects or landscape architects. We simply cannot be about having students doing professional work in the state. We think we've built up a very fine rapport with the state architects. You get a gentleman like Garrow Guy in Marion. He let us use his print machine. He's involved now. And this is the kind of mutual support that Ron Straka talked about in his letter following the Lafayette Route Ad. I think you have to give the communities a realistic assessment of what you can do. You don't go in there, offer them the world, and then throw them a crumb. And this is especially important when you deal with inner city neighborhoods. They've been promised the world, and they've been oftentimes given nothing. And the worst thing you can do is to go in there on your blazing white stallion and say, the Savior is here, watch out. And then after the quarter you say, oh, I got credit for 404, goodbye gang. I mean, that's just not right. And so I think that's part of an urban design studio. Basically, that's the responsibility of the faculty member, to really make it clear what you're there for. Obviously, as I said, you're providing a service, but I think you cannot go in there and say, well, we're going to save this neighborhood, obviously. And then, you yank bait after the quarter's over. The logistics of completing urban design studios under the quarter system are very difficult, and any faculty member who has done an urban design studio, I'm sure, will back me up. The quarter system of 10 weeks, basically 9 weeks of effective work, if you get it, simply does not allow for research and inventory, and that's why projects that can carry on beyond the initial involvement normally, generate better results. As you see, we spend a lot of time on evenings, weekends, vacations, and off hours. Funds are oftentimes non-existent. In most cases there, the funding has been minimal, except in the case of Methodist Hospital and Centreville, where I think we had adequate funding for the proposed project. And of course, you can produce the graphics, the final project, so on and so forth. I think lastly, the faculty member has to be responsible for reading the pulse of the situation. It can get a little bit nasty at times. I guess it's part of being, especially in inner city projects. We had to yank the boys on the charrette one time when we were threatened with our lives. We got ripped off twice in our studio working on Methodist Hospital, which is, you know, you say, yep, the crime rate is bad. That's all part of it. And I think you've got to be careful. I think the faculty member obviously is responsible for, and I use the word, for kind of feeling out the pulse. And sometimes, even like with Centreville, a nice, sleepy little town, you get the squeeze, and you get the squeeze from the public sector and the private sector, and I think the faculty member in charge has to be able to deal with it. You don't stop it. You don't stop that dynamics. That dynamics is important. I think you've got to be able to somehow manipulate it, and I mean that in a, not in a derogatory sense, but manipulate it in a way that it becomes a learning experience. And I think the students that have worked on Centreville have been exposed to some really neat group dynamics. I'm not a negative person. I would hate to end with kind of these warnings. Obviously, I believe in the system, or I wouldn't have been involved for the last 9 years with it. I'd like to end with 2 quotes. And I don't like quotes, but these are so darn good, and I don't believe in saying that they're mine. The first one is about the city, and obviously that's what we're discussing. The city is the focus of the involvement. And Sybil Maholanagi, who I was privileged to have at Pratt, who I took a history of city planning from, said this in her book about cities. She said, "Cities, like men, are embodiments of the past and mirages of unfulfilled dreams. They thrive on economy and waste, on exploitation and charity, on the initiative of the ego and the solidarity of the group. They stagnate and ultimately die under imposed standardization, homogenized equality, and a minimum denominator of man-made environment. Most decisive of all, cities, like mankind, renew themselves unit by unit in a slow, time-bound metabolic process." And I think that says just one heck of a lot about cities. The second one is about the process we've seen, the notion of architects and landscape architects and planners being involved in this thing we called urban design studios. And John Lindsay, who, whether you were for him politically before or after his switch, I think was a rather dynamic young mayor. I was privileged to be in New York during part of his term in office. And he did something really great. He brought architects out of our little shell and took them into city administration. And Jonathan Barnett, one of the young architects that he brought in, there was Richard Weinstein and several other people, wrote a book called Urban Design as Public Policy, and John Lindsay wrote the introduction. And then he ends, and John Lindsay says this about the architects that he was involved in. And for me, I hope it says something about maybe where our students have kind of come to also after their involvement. And Lindsay says, "In the process, I think they became fundamentally different people than they would have been if they had remained within the confines of the architectural profession. Instead of being architects who design buildings, they have become urban designers who can use their design skills in a variety of situations. They can work with politicians, developers, and neighborhood groups. They understand the forces that shape the city, and they have learned how to turn them in a new and better direction. They have emerged from the crucible of the city as a new kind of environmental professional." And maybe our students are a little bit closer to that as well. Whenever I talk about this, I always feel a little bit queasy, because obviously you're seeing the work of hundreds of people and thousands of man and woman hours. And I think that it's important to realize that I'm just, in a sense, a spokesman for that. A few thank yous are certainly in order. Norm Lingerman, #1, photo technician, for all his work in helping me set up here. And Norm was, I think the reason we have such great slides of the one-day Marion charrette process-wise was because Norm spent that day with us as well. Obviously, you don't do things like this without the okay of the higher-ups, and Dean Charles Sappenfield has certainly been tremendous in not only his approval, but in his pushing of urban design studios. And as I said, when you begin doing some of these things that are a little bit off the routine academic schedule and funding and so on and so forth, it's nice to have a person that is willing to support you. Obviously, the faculty of this college, those that are still with us and those that helped in some of the urban design studios and have since left to go on to probably bigger and better things. As a team, they have educated our students, and when you're in fourth year, you're getting the benefit of these students who have been educated by our faculty as a group. My wife, Missy, who puts up with just one heck of a lot of night meetings, a lot of days away, and it's very nice to have an understanding wife when you're in urban design. Most importantly, the students. It's their work that you've seen. It's their involvement that I certainly am very proud of, and I think the CAP can be as well. Thank you very much.